All right, now I want to take this framework and talk about valuing particular kinds of cash flows to develop the machinery that we're going to use later on. This is machinery that you already know, but in a context that I think will be more specific to our interests. The first, of course, is the perpetuity, the idea that if you've got a cash flow that pays the same amount of money every year forever, you can actually figure out what that value is. And as long as you've got a positive discount rate, it's pretty straightforward. Using some simple algebra, we can actually calculate the fact that the present value of a perpetuity that pays starting next year, C dollars every year, C, 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 out to infinity, that perpetuity has a very finite value. It's worth C divided by the interest rate. And so if C is $1,000, if you get $1,000 every year ad infinitum, and the discount rate is 10%, then the present value is simply equal to $10,000. Very nice result. Very beautiful formula, very compact, and it contains all the elements that we care about in terms of the time value of money and how discounting works over time. So, having said that climate change calculations are very difficult, nonetheless, there are opportunities to think about what these kinds of cash flows mean out into out in perpetuity. And so it's not to say that we ignore them, it's just that the discounting happens geometrically fast. Okay, so the second formula that we went over in Introductory Finance is the growing perpetuity. This is a little bit more interesting. This is where the cash flows grow over time. So you start off next year with C, but then the year after it's C times 1 plus the growth rate, G. Then the year after it's C times 1 plus G squared, and so on and so forth. And once again, you can use standard arithmetrics to calculate the present value here. And the present value is C divided by R minus G, where R is assumed always to be greater than G. So the idea is that if you've got some cash flows that are growing over time, that's going to be worth more than if they're not growing. And you can quantify how much more by looking at the C divided by R minus G and getting a sense of the value of that kind of growth. Where this comes into play is in looking at situations like corporations where you're expecting the company is on a growth path and actually doing better and better over time. If the growth is in perpetuity, you can actually put a number on that. So in this case, if you've got $1,000 every year starting next year, the growth rate is 5% and the discount rate is 10%, now the value of this is not $10,000, but it's $20,000. And it turns out that very, very small changes in G can lead to some tremendous changes in market value simply because the denominator, R minus G, is very, very sensitive to perturbations. And the example that I'd like to use is what happened in the case of Puma Biotechnology. This is a pharmaceutical company, or rather a biotech company, that's looking to grow up to be a pharmaceutical company. They've got a breast cancer drug, neratinib, that's in clinical trials. And on July 22nd, 2014, Puma experienced an extraordinary increase in the value of its shares. Literally, overnight, it jumped from about $60 a share to something on the order of $230 a share. In one day. One day this happened. And what happened on that day? What happened was it announced that it had reached its clinical endpoint for neratinib's phase 3 trial for breast cancer. Extremely promising results in phase 3. Now, they've since come back down for a variety of other reasons. It turns out that there are side effects of that drug, one of which is severe diarrhea. And it's actually quite difficult to control. And in subsequent clinical trials, they found that it's not all that easy to control this with other antidiuretics. So these kinds of market moves happen very quickly because small changes in G. And an example is, I got news today that the FDA approved this drug. That's fantastic. This is going to grow like weeds. That's a change in G that actually causes the market to update its value. Small changes in G can lead to tremendous changes in market value. And that's actually one of the reasons that the pharma companies experience much more volatility than in other industries. It's because they're experiencing this information shocks, these binary events where approved or rejected happens in the course of a day all that information gets impounded into the market's expectations about what's going to happen out into the infinite future. So we are amortizing the impact of a decision over the course of many, many years. That's what causes these huge market swings. So let me give you another example from the pharma company, which is Amgen. Amgen is one of the leading biotechnology/pharma companies. We talked about that last week. It's one of the largest companies with a huge amount of cash on its balance sheets, as well as long-term debt. So the question is Amgen overvalued or undervalued? Here's a very quick back-of-the-envelope calculation that I don't want any of you to take seriously, but it actually shows you kind of in a nice way how you might use some of the analytics that we develop. Okay, so what we're going to do is a simple net cash flow analysis of Amgen. Amgen has about $10.3 billion in net cash flows as of last year. That's the amount of cash that was just coming through the company to its shareholders. That's a lot of cash. And so over the next 5 years, their earnings are actually forecasted to grow 6.7%. That is an astonishing growth rate. Now, of course, that's not G, but let's pretend that it was. But it's not. The reason it's not G is that G is the growth rate that goes on in perpetuity. I don't think anybody believes that Amgen can sustain growth of 6.7% forever. And I can give you examples. In a few minutes, I'll take a look of other companies that have different kinds of growth rates, so you can sort of see what earnings growth looks like. In fact, let's do that now, just so you can get a sense of what these numbers look like. So let's take, retail as an example. Anybody want to guess what the growth rate of Walmart's earnings might be over the course of the next 5 years? So let me go to the financeyahoo.com. So what do you think Walmart's growth rate is estimated to be? Its earnings growth rate over the course of the next 5 years that Wall Street analysts have proposed. What do you think? 5%? 6%? 3? 2? Yeah, you're going the right direction. So for the next 5 years, Walmart's estimated growth rate is 2.83%. So Amgen looks like a fantastic bargain at 6.77%, unless, of course, the price is already accounted for that. So that gives you a sense of what these growth rates look like. By the way, what do you think Facebook's growth rate is? Or then let's forget about Facebook. What about Apple? Apple is the most valuable company on the planet. It just exceeded Google by $120 billion in market cap. It's reached the highest level of market cap. It's more valuable than Exxon and JP Morgan put together. So what do you think Apple's growth rate is for the next 5 years? What would you guess? 5%. Yeah, because I mean, a company that large, there's no way you can sustain growth of 6 or 7%, right? So let's take a look at Apple. I think you'll be surprised. So Apple's growth rate for the next 5 years is estimated to be 9.25%. That is insane. The largest company in the world. I guess there's a reason that they're the largest company in the world. They produce stuff people want to buy. And so these growth rates are not steady state out into the infinite future. That can't possibly be the case for Apple. And the same thing with Amgen. So 6.77% is not meant to be the G. But if we pretended it was the G, and if we pretended that we knew its cost of capital, the R that was supposed to be discounting the cash flows. I got that from a website called gurufocus.com. They use a variety of tools to estimate the cost of capital, which we will be talking about in about 2 weeks. 12.55% is what they estimate for Amgen. Okay, that's the R that is supposed to be appropriate for this company. If we did that calculation and just did a net present value using this growing perpetuity formula and dividing by the number of shares to calculate the per share price, we would get an estimate of Amgen that is $242.64 a share. That's what it should be worth today. what is Amgen trading at? It's trading at $167.89. So either we just discovered an incredibly undervalued asset, or we made a mistake in our calculations. Now, we could have made a mistake in the cash flows, but that was actually what we got from their accounting information. That was their net cash flow last year. So most likely where we are off is either in the R or the G. And as I said, G is not the sustainable growth rate of a company out into the infinite future. So typically when we do valuation exercises, we actually focus on more sophisticated methods. We actually use a combination of phases of the company. Part of it is over a finite period of time where they are growing. Then part of it is when they are stable and not really doing a lot of new innovation. And part of it may be during its decline when it's actually being outcompeted by smaller and more nimble competitors. So that's the approach that financial analysts take in coming up with their valuations. We won't have time to cover that in this class, but that's basically an application of these kinds of formulas. So I thought it would be kind of fun just to see how the numbers work out. We'll come back to this example in a little bit later on when we add a little bit more detail.